I have a friend. We'll call him Will Thompson for the sake of anonymity, but Will Thompson's not his name. Will lives south of Altadena, a little off Woodbury, on a beautiful neighborhood street in the Pasadena city limits, with his wife, two kids, and two large dogs. He didn't lose his house in Eaton Fire, but a neighbor just five doors down did. They got close, real close. However, since that fateful day in January, the Thompson family's been displaced. Their home was not safe to live in, and their insurance provider, State Farm, wasn't helping. Multiple adjusters, long delays in communications, very little in writing. Just another example of why Altadena says, like a shit neighbor, State Farm is there. Will's family is one of many struggling with State Farm. Just last week, our guest Neil Tyler brought up how bad the company has been in its response. One person who's really upset by this is my son. He likes Jake from State Farm. He thinks the commercials with Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes are funny. He doesn't understand why a company that tries to be so likable is putting our family friends in such a bind. There's a lot to be upset with in the aftermath of the Eaton Fire. But friends and neighbors who have homes covered in soot and ash being forced out for 4 months and given the runaround for straightforward remediation needs, it's high on the list. A couple weeks back, Will got fed up and hired an attorney. Surprise, surprise, things started moving in the right direction shortly after. The cleanup is happening. He's getting what he asked for. And hopefully, we'll be back hanging in the Thompsons' backyard sometime this summer. But Will had to fight for this. He also had to make a lot of sacrifices. They live with friends and a one-bedroom ADU. That's right. Will, his wife, two kids, and those two large dogs. They crammed in there together. Did the best they could. He also had some money that he fronted on expenses that he hopes is going to be repaid. He thinks will be repaid, but there's no given. Not everyone had the same options. Not everyone had the determination and or resources to fight this big bad wolf. Instead, many neighbors felt forced to do their best to scrub their homes, move back in, and cross their fingers that the toxicity of the fire doesn't lead to some serious health issues. As a business owner, I've always thought the idea of insurance as a for-profit entity makes zero sense. All right, at least morally. Businesses grow by being profitable. For an insurance company to be as profitable as possible, their goal has to be to pay as little as possible for every claim they get. That's not something a good neighbor would do. And so this is another place where instead of fairness and equity, we have to turn to attorneys for support. Nobody understands that better than our guest today, Renee Callantine from the Cornerstone Law Group. Renee specializes in helping policyholders get what they deserve from their insurance providers. She's worked fire cases all over the state. And one of the reasons why she's so good at what she does, she started on the other side. More on that, I bet. We're going to dive into Renee's history, and then we're going to go into a handful of the avalanche of issues Eaton Fire victims are currently fighting right now. There's a lot of them, and each one leads to more confusion, more ambiguity, more of our time. This isn't TV. Altadena doesn't have Jake from State Farm answering our calls and telling us everything we want to hear. We have the opposite. Adjuster after adjuster, excuse after excuse, delay after delay, disaster after disaster. I'm Austin LaRoche, and this is the Altadena Rebuild, Episode 8, Disaster Insurance. Renee, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, let's start with you. All right, so tell us about your journey towards becoming such an advocate for policyholders against their insurance companies, particularly with wildfires.
Good question. So early in my career, I started out with a firm that represented insurance companies in bad faith litigation lawsuits. So I've represented insurance companies for a number of years. I eventually became a partner in a firm, and there were some upward pressures. My firm had a lot of business litigators, and they were able to charge more than the insurance attorneys. So there were some upward pressures on our rates, making it difficult to get work. At the same time, those business partners were coming to me saying, my clients can't get insurance coverage. Can you help me? So it was kind of a natural transition for one. And secondly, there was some disillusion that was occurring. And, I can't detail that, obviously, because I still have, I don't want to badmouth my prior clients. But most of all, to be honest, Austin, it was just growing up and becoming, living life and becoming a more empathetic person as I lived life and I, started seeing that where a young me would have had high expectations of people to do things like read their entire policy and, know every little nook and cranny and all their responsibilities and not mess up on anything. The older me realized that, not everyone has the bandwidth of a 20-something attorney. And, I just got more empathetic and my sympathies started lying more with the policyholders.
And I think that's a great context, because if you've seen both sides of this, it can help understand, what is actually fair and in other ways legal, right?
Mhm.
And, maybe where some of us might even feel aggrieved, but based off our policy, it isn't necessarily what our feelings are. So I'm really
Mhm.
excited to dive in. I've asked a few people for different questions that they've had, because I know this has been a struggle for so many people.
Yes.
But I guess I want to start with the idea of an attorney versus a public adjuster, because as we all started this journey and we know nothing, we're now experts 4 months in, which is great.
Right.
But everyone's like, well, if your insurance isn't giving you what you want, you can go to a public adjuster. And obviously
Right.
we know their deal; they take a percentage. When would it be smarter for a policyholder to go to a public adjuster versus an attorney like yourself?
Okay, that's a great question. Let me start with when you would really want to go with an attorney. And my feeling, even though it's contrary to my business interests, is that really you don't need to go to an attorney immediately right out of the gate. Some people want to lawyer up. I just don't think that's necessary. I think that you want to wait and hire an attorney when you realize that you've come to an impasse with your insurance company and it's going to take an attorney to get any more benefits, and I don't mean that you have to wait for years. You can put a reasonable deadline on it. You can, make it clear with the insurance company that they're either stalling, or they're just taking an unreasonable position, or, they're ramping up on you and keep asking you for more and more things. But, you've got to decide. But at some point, I would say try to get what you can before you go to an attorney. With a public adjuster, it's a little bit different because it depends on who you are. And how busy you are and what sort of bandwidth you have for doing tedious work. A public adjuster can be very good in putting together the claim if it's something that, you don't want to have to list all of your contents out. You don't want to have to track down a contractor to get an estimate. Things like that. They can help you find a rental place or set you up with a real estate agent. Now, they are going to take a percentage of your recovery. And the thing to know and to understand is that if you think you're going to want a public adjuster, you really should get a public adjuster from the get-go, because
Hmm.
if you've already recovered all the low-hanging fruit, and then you'd say, well, I think I'll have the public adjuster do all this nasty stuff that, I haven't been able to get to. Either the public adjuster is not going to want that case because you've already got all the easy money, or they're going to make you actually pay them a portion of what you've already recovered, which doesn't seem fair because they haven't worked for that, right? So you might as
Yeah.
well get them in there right at the beginning if you think you're going to need them. And again, you're taking a cut, a 10%. They're going to take a 10% cut at least, and sometimes I'm hearing now more because they're so busy they've been able to up their fees. So it's a lot of it's a financial consideration. It's a consideration for how busy of a person you are. But that I hope that's answered your question. That those would be my general comments.
Absolutely. And I think it's such a tough thing the more I think about it, right? Once you've lost your home and you've got a million decisions to make, and one of those being the public adjuster, which you're right, like just thinking about what this process has been like for us so far, if you were going to do it, doing it from the beginning makes a ton of sense. Whereas if now you've gone down this path, you trusted your insurance, you thought it was going to be there for you, and now it's not necessarily what you want, then that would be a time to kind of consider legal representation. So with this type of case, and I'm sure different attorneys do things differently, but is it more of a contingency base? Is it more an hourly fee? How do you structure an engagement for this type of case?
So with the wildfires and with a homeowner, this isn't an enormously lucrative area of work for me, but it is important, and I do enjoy doing it. I think that you'll find most attorneys will charge a percentage. So the way that I personally work is that first of all, anybody can call me and I'll give them, a half hour or so of my time and try to guide them if they've just got general questions about the process. A lot of times people come to me ready to hire me and I'll say, this doesn't make sense. You've only got $65,000 at issue here. First of all, I don't want that really, quite frankly. And secondly, it doesn't make sense for you to hire an attorney, but let me tell you what I suggest you do. If I take a case, I usually will charge about 25% if we don't have to go through to litigation. So, because a lot of attorneys will skip that part. If you go to them, they're going to file a lawsuit. That's not my business model. My business model is to try to see if we can get some resolution before. Now, I can usually tell based upon what the issues are, whether that's going to be the case. I won't try that if it's futile. But if I think that there's some area where an attorney letter might get some additional benefits, I'll try to do that and, see if we can resolve the claim that way. And then if I do have to file litigation, then then the fee goes up to, 33%. If we have to go to trial, 40%. And again, it kind of depends on what the amount of damages at issue. And those are generally negotiable. So, if you have a relatively easy claim and you've got millions and millions of dollars, if you're, Tom Hanks, and you can probably find somebody to do that for less. But then again, you're Tom Hanks, so maybe not. I don't know. But, it's not that it's not negotiable. And even just getting back to what I said about the public adjusters and their taking that percentage of what you've already received, there's nothing to say that you can't negotiate that. You can try to negotiate that. So I just want to, be fair to public adjusters that is. I know that they do get a bad rap, especially when they're circling around your house as the smoke, still embers burning.
I will say this. I talked to a few that I didn't even know were public adjusters, people I know in my past from college, and every single one of them I talked to did say your best route is, if you feel like your insurance is being fair, to stick with them and work with them. So I feel like I've got some good advice there. Now you've been on both sides of this, so I think the audience will be very interested in hearing your answer to this. What are some of the most common tactics that the insurance companies use to delay, deflect, or even deny wildfire-related claims?
You sound like Luigi. Bad joke. In all honesty, what I mostly see is just a flat out delay with being non-responsive. And that is, to be fair, mostly due to just the caseload of these adjusters during these catastrophic claims. Not only that, do the local adjusters have an increase in their caseloads, but typically then you're going to see all of these independent adjusters, because the insurers are going to have to go outside of their own workforce and bring people in from other areas of the country. And then those people might not know the California regulations that require, for instance, that you respond to communications within a certain deadline. And so you'll see some sloppy work, they'll be valuing things based upon the value, back home in Louisiana and not in Southern California and things like that. But that's the most common thing I see, is just a non-responsiveness. Secondly, there are occasionally when, especially this is sometimes triggered by being overworked, they'll keep pushing back at you like, okay, well, that's a great estimate. Go get an estimate to clean up the smoke and get it, and they'll keep asking you for things, and they'll keep, a lot of times they'll say, well, this is being looked at by the committee or by the supervisors. And you just have to keep asking questions, just like with anything else. Well, when is that going to be decided? When does the committee meet? When will we have this decision? And just keep their feet to the fire. Those are that's the most common thing I see, is just a delay with either not responding, or just asking for more and more things.
That really tracks with what we're seeing, particularly in a specific case. And I'm going to talk to you about total loss versus partial loss in a little bit more. But what I've seen so much with my partial loss friends, because they've had much more difficulties than I have, but I've seen that because they do all of this, it's people just they have no choice but to move back to their house. Right? Like, they're staying with friends. They're not even getting funds for the hotel, or they can't float it until it's reimbursed. And so it's just like, you know what? I'll clean the darn thing myself. So that's been pretty bad. So help us understand a little bit about why it's so much harder for those who've experienced, partial damage, partial loss, to get, fair settlements than those of us who just are in this total loss bucket.
Yes. Well, you're totally right. It is so much easier when you have a total loss, and that's because nobody's going to argue over the scope of repairs. The home needs to be rebuilt. Now, you may argue about how much that's going to cost and what that's going to entail, but nobody's going to deny that the home needs to be rebuilt. When you have a partial loss, then you've got, all these, is this really damaged? Does this really need rebuilt? Does this really need done? And you start getting some sharp practices by the insurance companies. And that's where it's really important to know your rights. So, for instance, a lot of times I will see that an insurance company is just trying to limit, let's say one part of the house burned and collapsed or something in response to the fire. They will just want to rebuild that part of the house. But they do have other requirements, because sometimes those rebuilding that part of the house triggers other code requirements, from the building code. And those aren't always black and white. Those are always sometimes the subject of arguments between the insurance company and policyholder. And the other thing is that, like, for instance, you have a right when part of your house is being rebuilt, anything within the line of sight, like, they can't just stop painting and drywalling something and then leave, a total demarcation between the part of the house they're not fixing and the part of the house they are. You're entitled, even if they say that part of the house wasn't damaged, you're entitled to have that redone so that it looks, and the same with the flooring, so little things like that, but they add up. You also find things like especially where it's a smoke damage claim. What is the smoke damage? A lot of times, they want to clean it with smoke and, soap and water. And that very rarely is sufficient because a lot of times these ashes have dangerous chemicals in them. They might have lead. They're supposed to be tested. I mean, it's so bad with the insurance companies and what they've done that the insurance commissioner has actually had to put out a bulletin, telling the insurance companies, here's what we expect of you. We expect you to do the testing and not put this burden on the policyholder. But there's, they won't want to open the walls and see what the insulation is like. They won't want to see whether maybe the electrical wiring has been compromised. I mean, I've seen it melted before. Sometimes even, if the heat gets close enough to and I'm starting to sound like I'm a contractor now, but I've done so many of these. If the heat gets close enough to the house, even the seals of the windows could be compromised. Ash could get under the tile roofs. All of those things are things that the insurance company is just going to push back on. They're not going to start lifting up those tiles and looking under them. You have to know to tell them to do that. And you might not know, and you might initially just go with their soap and water fix. And then, 3 months later, when you're back in your house, you start smelling smoke and you start getting sick because there's chemicals that have been released and they haven't been properly cleaned. So
for our friends in that situation, I want to follow up on this because I think I have people who I think are going to be in this situation. What could or should they do once the soap and water's done and then they show up and their house still smells like smoke, or they don't realize it for a couple of weeks, but it smells like smoke? What legal opportunities do they have to get a more just settlement after that?
Well, okay, so a couple of things. First of all, there's the whole issue of not letting it get to that point. But let's just say you have let that get to that point. You're back home and you're realizing, oh, this isn't like it used to be. You call the insurance company back up. They have an ongoing obligation. So if during the course of this more damage is discovered and what you thought was fixed isn't really fixed, you go back to them. Now, you have to go back to them, within a good amount of time. You can't wait a year or 2 years because then you might run into time issues and limitation issues that are in the policy. But, if a few months down the line, you're smelling things, you're feeling the wind come through the window, or, the electricity is sparking. I mean, just any kind of thing like that, you call back. And sometimes you just have to get your own people out there. It's unfortunate, but sometimes that's just the best way to go, is to get somebody back in and just send them a report and say, look, this is what my guy found. And by the way, I want you to pay for this report.
I was going to, so I want to explore that. So, what you said was that they need to make sure that your house is as close to the way it was before as possible, which I think is a pretty easy standard. So if I'm doing these things, I paid them, they've done the soap and water. Now I feel like, oh my gosh, they're getting, there's still stuff. I still smell smoke. Your suggestion would be to hire someone to come in, do a full report it was unbiased. And then at that point, you send that to the insurance company and you said, oh, by the way, this cost me $2,000 for that. You're going to pay for that too. And that's all within most policyholders' rights.
That is, they might push back on the paying. It depends on whether they've had their own person do it. And then, whether your guys found something more. I mean, it's not black and white as to what they will do with regard to paying, but let me be very clear. I don't recommend that anybody move back into their home without, if they've had ash and soot in their home, or even just severe smoke, I don't recommend that anybody go back in without having environmental testing done.
Nice.
I mean, it's just, it's just not smart for your health.
And what I think a lot of people feel that way. but then
Mhm.
there's the economics, right? And if they don't have another place to be, is there a belief that, if they put, let's say, a hotel room on a credit card or a Airbnb on a credit card, that would eventually be reimbursed? Do the, because that's the fear, right? Is like, I can put
Mhm.
this up, but what happens if they don't pay for that, for this? Is there
Right.
is there anything we could
It's
tell
always,
people in that situation?
well, that's a hard situation. Because I don't want to sit here and promise that they will get paid. Um,
Certainly.
but but that is something that you can certainly do. You will definitely want to keep track of all of those expenses, and you want to let the insurance company know beforehand. Even if they say, no, don't do that, we haven't agreed to pay for that. You've given them notice. You've said, look, I don't believe it's safe. Ricardo Lara, our insurance commissioner in California, doesn't believe it's safe, and in fact has a bulletin that anybody can access on the Department of Insurance website telling the insurers. If you go on the website, you go under the consumer section and there's bulletins. One of the bulletins that came out after the Eaton Fire and the Palisades Fire is, he's telling the insurance companies, you need to do this testing. Testing has to be done. You need to do it. And the policyholders should not bear the cost of it. And he even recommended that as a first step, that the insurance companies apparently there's these take-home tests that you can do. And I'm not sure whether they're totally reliable or not, but the Department of Insurance is recommending that the insurance companies actually provide those to their policyholders. If they can't go out and get environmental testing immediately for everyone, that they at least do that as a first step. Now,
Okay.
if those test positive, then you've got a problem. If they test negative, that doesn't necessarily, I don't know that I would necessarily rely on those as being dispositive, especially when sometimes there's things within the walls, and there's a whole other issue I haven't even mentioned, and that's if the fire suppression efforts got to the point where they've actually hosed down the walls, because then you've got a water issue that, because sometimes they'll poke holes in the house to make sure that there's no embers. Water will get into the house and into those walls, and then you might have a mold issue. So that all has to be looked at.
Okay. So I want to talk about Ricardo Lara. So he's the California Insurance Commissioner. And, the big headline came out shortly after the fire that he wanted insurers to pay 100% of personal property limits for both Eaton and Palisade fire victims. I know I personally got 75% from my insurance company. They honored that. I guess I'll start with Commissioner Lara to begin with. What power does he have? Is he just making suggestions? Can he, what can he do and what can he do?
So I believe that when he issues something as a bulletin, it is a recommendation. It is a strong recommendation, and certainly it can be used in any subsequent litigation. I would argue it could be used as showing the standard of care, right, that an insurance company should be followed. However, it isn't really enforceable. He can't sue the insurance companies for that, and you can't sue the insurance companies just for not doing that, right? So it doesn't have that sort of binding force. And in fact, none of the insurance regulations have that teeth, the teeth that you can actually sue on for non-compliance. I think that Laura actually, I must have missed the part where he came out and told them to pay 100% of, are you talking about the personal property limits?
The personal property
Contents?
limits.
Yeah.
Without having to do any inventory.
His bulletin suggests, I believe, 30%, up to like $250,000. And you have to be careful with that advice because, you mentioned that your insurer gave you 75% and, no problem, they complied. And it's interesting because you think, wow, my insurance company did something great for me. Well, let me be cynical.
Okay.
I think that the reason why a lot of these insurance companies are giving the 75%, I think the 75% is very interesting. And it is a percentage that a lot of the insurance companies are giving. And I suspect that, because in order to get that last 25%, you have to document the 75% you've already gotten and the additional part. And I just think that a lot of these insurance companies are banking on the fact that once you get that 75%, all that work it's going to take to document that 100%, the whole 100% of your loss, you might not do it. And they might save 25% of those limits. Just a thought. Just me being cynical.
No. You're not wrong. You're not wrong. Well, I have a WhatsApp channel with other people in our who have Mercury Insurance. It's the insurance I have. They've been great so far, so I don't mind mentioning them. But there's some great people in that group who are like, no, I'm hell bent on this. I'm going through everything. I'm getting that last 25%. And I know it can be really difficult, particularly with things like collectibles, right? A once in a lifetime, things that have so much emotional value, but also that can have value, to other collectors, right? Art is something subjective like that. I know for kids, my Pokemon cards. I know when we first started, I was like, all right, what are your best cards, Xavier? What? and I think we're starting to learn that the value of that is more the value of a paper card than it is some sort of collectible. How do insurance companies look at those different types of collectibles?
Well, there's certain things that are actually in the in your policy that are limited. So there's certain limits for various types of things, simply because they don't want to get into that valuation issue. And in fact, a lot of times, if you do have truly valuable things, now this is hindsight is 2020, but really. A lot of times you can schedule some of those things. So you could get separate insurance for that at a certain value, just going forward, just to know. But you're right. With respect to those the items that are collectible, one of a kind, if there's not a limitation, a specific limitation in the policy on those, then what you do need to look to, sometimes you have to go to appraisers for those. And the insurance company should be doing that. They should be doing that. And then you might not want to trust their appraiser's value. You might want to actually get your own, but there are ways to value those collectible items, if they're not limited, if there isn't a certain stated limit in your policy for the particular item, that's how you would do it. That's how you would do it. You would go to an appraisal service for that.
No, that makes sense. And I think your cynicism is for the 75%. The more I think about it, it's definitely a bit it's definitely something we've had a lot of conversations with, like whether it's with our fire attorneys or just internal, like how much do we want to go through and do all of this? How much are we okay with that 75%? And it's quite satisfying. I think there's an emotional ROI, and I think what you're saying is not wrong, but there also might be a win-win, right? There might be an emotional ROI that's not worth the other 25%. For some of us, whereas others, and I like that determination too. Oops. All right, we've got a new guest joining us today.
Stevie
All
Nicks
right. Oh, I love that. That's wonderful. All right, Stevie. Stevie said it was time for us to jump back on. So we were just making a quick. We were just talking a little bit of that 75, 25%, and maybe some of the emotional ROI.
Yeah.
And I know we're going to kind of address some of the fatigue that you've seen homeowners have. Stevie.
Okay, she's outside. I mean, my God, you're tired. You're trying to rebuild your home. You're trying to rebuild your home. You're trying to, you replace your contents. you've got 75%, let's say you had 400,000, you've already got the 300,000, that 100,000, that's a lot of money, but
Yeah.
that's a lot of work.
One less decision to make as well, right?
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
to your point. All right. So I
Yeah.
want to talk about
So I
just,
recommend with respect to that issue,
Mhm.
get on it right away, because as time goes by, first of all, you forget what you had, but more
Mhm.
importantly, it just fades, So if you really want to do it, you got to just buckle down and get it done.
And I'll also note that there's a lot of people, I'm sure you guys have some sort of guide that you help others use, like a template to be able to go through the
Mhm.
house so they can think of all of the things. I know I've seen some of that as well from
Yeah.
different representation.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to jump ship. I want to talk a little bit about the size of insurance companies. So I'm not going to name any names, but it's been very, very clear for those of us who've had smaller insurance companies, like our friends at Mercury. It's been a lot easier than our friends with the insurance companies that will just say have the celebrities and the commercials that we've all known and know well.
Mhm.
One, why do you think that is? And two, is that consistent with other recent wildfires?
I don't know is the answer.
Okay.
I can make some general comments about that. One is it really just depends on who you get. And so I suspect that what may happen is because these large insurance companies have larger books of business, much larger books, they are more likely to be bringing people in from around the country. And, I'm not casting any aspersions on these independent adjusters who come from outside the country, but there's a learning curve there. And California is its own animal, and nobody can understand how expensive things are here. And so everything is like, oh, you wanted $100 for that hotel room, and it really boggles people's minds if they're from Kentucky or Louisiana or Alabama. Things don't cost that much there. And and I think that's part of it is just those larger firms are going to be more likely to have to bring more people in because they've got a larger volume of cases. But it really is, there's good reps and there's bad reps at every company. And so people always say, is State Farm good insurance or is this Farmers good insurance? I can't tell you that. It depends on who you get, and who their supervisor is and who their manager is. And,
Okay. All right. I would say there's some community groups that might disagree with you, but you have got to play this one straight. So I'm not gonna push back at all on it. I will just say
it used to be. I would say very early in my career, and this was when I was still representing insurance companies. And one of the big insurance companies that has the celebrities in the commercials, we found out when defending a lawsuit against them that they actually were running an incentive program with their claims groups about like who could pay the lowest amount in claims. And somehow it became discovered by policyholder attorneys, and boy was that a problem we had to resolve very quickly. So there shouldn't be any more of that going on. Whether there is, I don't know. I'm no longer privy to that kind of thing because I don't work on that side anymore, but they used to do stuff like that. And a lot of times you do things like that and then somebody gets bitten badly by it, and the practice
they definitely
continues for a while. And then what happens is they start paying too much in claims, and the claims cycle it goes in waves. So for a long time, the insurance companies may be taking advantage, and they're getting very good decisions in court, and then they start getting a couple of bad hits and bad judgments against them, and then they fall into line for a while and they start really, minding their P's and Q's, and then they're paying too much in claims, and all of a sudden they start acting up again, and it's cyclical.
That's a really good point. And it's something I haven't thought of because this is obviously going to be a major event, right? This is a major insurance event. Everybody in LA is already talking about what is this going to do to my home insurance policy. If these two regions could just get hit on a crazy day in January, like what is it? What is the future of this even going to look like? And
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of unknowns with that. What are there any legal? Is there? Let me ask it this way: if every single company decided we're no longer going to give wildfire as part of our home insurance policy, is there anything that's illegal with that?
Well, they would have to change the insurance code because there's, there's a, there's insurance statutes that provide what a fire policy has to provide and the coverage that it has to provide. What is more likely is what we are already seeing, and that's insurers pulling out of California and other wildfire prone areas. And, like you may have heard that State Farm just in this week, I believe, got approval for, I believe, a 20 or 22% rate hike, which would have been unheard of before. But we're desperate to keep the insurance companies in here because otherwise everything falls to the California FAIR Plan. And that's not tenable. That's not going to work. So we've got a real insurance problem here in California.
I think that's probably the natural conclusion. And I think even after going through all of this, I'll be honest, I think we upped our insurance. This is not something that I would have done on my own for sure. But we thought that we were going to have to replace an air conditioner, and we weren't sure if we were going to be able to figure out how to get our home insurance policy to be able to do it. So we just decided we'd get the most favorable one for us. And after going through this and seeing what's been available to us, and to me, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I will pay more for good insurance across the board. So knowing that, okay, the rate hikes are going to come, that's not great, especially for the affordability of California, which is obviously a major issue. But I don't think it's as much of an issue as everybody leaving. and so so as you're explaining this to me, it sounds like that's going to be our upcoming battle, right? It's how do we keep insurance companies here? How do we keep insurance as affordable as possible moving forward? But as long as they are here, wildfires will be covered. Am I hearing that correctly?
So, wildfires, I can't, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can't imagine wildfires being excluded. But what you might find is a paring down of coverage in other ways, limits on certain things, debris removal, etc. For instance, it used to be that you could get something in California called a guaranteed replacement cost policy. And that meant that no matter what your policy limit was for your home, if it was destroyed by something that was covered by your insurance policy, they would pay whatever it costs to replace. And that was important because when there's a catastrophe like an earthquake or something, those prices skyrocket because there's a shortage, right? And so after the Northridge earthquake, the carriers took that off the table. No more guaranteed replacement costs. Now we've got something else that is called an extended replacement cost. It's a little bit different, but it's less coverage. So you might start seeing that. But you raised an issue that I'd like to address, even though it wasn't a question you asked.
Yeah.
Once you find an insurance company that will write your policy and will insure your home, it's very important that you take it upon yourself to make sure that your home, that coverage A, the dwelling limit, which is basically what sets the other limits, because the other limits are typically a percentage of those. Make sure that it's high enough. It will never be high enough if you just take the amount that the agent puts it on for based upon some program that they raise their numbers in, especially for a catastrophic loss where, like I said, all the prices get knocked up. And the incremental cost of insuring your home for $2 million and insuring it for $3 million is surprisingly low. And so it really pays to actually look at those and up those limits. Always up them some would be my rule of thumb. And really take a good look at it. Can I really rebuild this house for $150 a square foot? No, not in LA County, you can't. Not in where I am in San Mateo County, up north you can't.
Oh no. Wow. And I think that's really great advice. And, I think that because now so many people who were not affected directly by the fires, but are now, if the Palisades and Altadena can burn, it could happen for all of us. Right. And so moving forward, I think that's amazing advice, is to always look at that dwelling, because it does. If you probably don't even know about your home insurance policy if you're somebody who just bought a house, like, what are we doing? Okay, great. And these different buckets, the loss of use funds, the personal property, the dwelling. If you haven't gone through this whole thing, I'll just say the dwelling is essentially the money that goes towards rebuilding the home and clearing the debris, any ADU or other structures. That all gets decided based off of that dwelling. And so
that dwelling limit. That's right.
Yeah, that's excellent advice.
And I think people assume, well, the agent will surely try to sell me the most insurance as possible. So probably if they set the limit, that limit will be fine. But really what they want to do is they want to sell you the policy. And, that might be just taking, that might just be getting you the, $100 difference in a premium might be between, the difference between you going with one company and the next company. And so they're going to keep it pretty low, generally speaking. And it's based usually on some archaic formula of some software that hasn't been updated and certainly doesn't take into consideration the increase in prices that occurs after a catastrophe.
And so this is something that can you negotiate? Can you say, I'd like to pay more and get more? What does that look like with your agent?
I just say, I want to up this. I want to add another $500,000 to my dwelling limit.
Okay.
That's generally not a problem. At least it hasn't been. We'll see if it,
All right. So that's excellent advice for those listening who, are going to come at this more preventative. Stevie. All right. Stevie has given us permission to finish. She said, I'm good now. I got this. All right. So I want to talk about the people who are, currently trying to figure out their insurance policy. Because I think a lot of people said, like, if you look at your full policy and you go through it all, like, you probably owed a lot more money than you think. What are the areas that homeowners may have more access to additional funds than they realize?
And let me start by telling you that the insurance company is required to, once you submit a claim, to let you know what all your coverages are and what's available to you. So a lot of times, though, and in my experience, they typically do at some point early on in the claim send you that letter that tells you that. But by that time, you're so discombobulated that you might not even see it. So let me just go over quickly. Typically, basically you have your dwelling A limit, that is for your home. Then you have your usually a separate limit, a separate coverage for what they call appurtenant or other structures. And those are for things that are attached to the house. It might be a shed, it might be a patio, it might be the fence, etc. Then you have your contents limit. And then you have what they call the additional living expenses or loss of rents, loss of use limits. That's what is to pay if you're displaced from your home, or you had a rental property and you can't rent it out anymore. Then in addition to those main coverages, which everybody pretty much knows about, you have separate coverages for and some of them are optional. Like, for instance, code upgrade coverage. That's an optional coverage. That will pay for if there are additional code requirements. Because typically, let me back up and say that typically what your dwelling coverage pays for is to put the house back the way it was. That's what it's supposed to pay for. But sometimes you can't put your house back the way it was because there's code requirements. So unless you have that code upgrade coverage, you're on the hook to pay those code upgrades yourself, and they can be costly. So that's a separate coverage that you may or may not have. You may also have something called extended replacement cost coverage. And that is what has come into place instead of that guaranteed replacement cost coverage that I was talking about earlier. So in other words, instead of just giving free rein and saying whatever it costs, we'll pay for it, the carriers are still offering some of that, but they're offering it as a percentage of your coverage A. So they'll say, we'll go 100% over your coverage A, if you need that to build your home back the way it was. That doesn't mean you have to build your home back the way it was, but they will look at that in deciding what to pay. And that can also get into, some arguments, because if you're building it back in a way that's different, then it becomes a question of, well, what would have it cost to build it as it was? Then there are other things like debris removal. A lot of times after these wildfires, and the Eaton Fire is no different, the county will pick up a lot of that debris removal. And so debris removal doesn't become a big issue, but that's usually stated as a percentage of your coverage A. If the debris removal plus the cost of replacing your house is above the limit, an additional limit, 5% over that. There's trees, shrubs, and bushes or something like that. I can't remember.
Yeah.
That's an additional an additional limit. So there are a lot of little things like that, but those are the main ones that the policy provides for that people don't recognize, because you have to read those little additional coverages and
Yeah. So in my experience, they give you the letter, right? That kind of is the overview of everything. And then you ask for the full policy, and that takes forever. And when you get it back, I got a fully scanned document, which means you can't like Control F or anything like that. Oh, maybe in the past you couldn't, but now you can, because there's a ton of different documents that'll take, or softwares that will take that and turn it into a Word document. So I got my full policy as like scanned, like 30 pages or something, put it in a Word document. And then from there, I was able to kind of start Control F-ing. And I'll be honest, I uploaded it to ChatGPT and started asking a bunch of questions about, what it could do and what it couldn't. And I think that's, again, it's just another one of those things that the insurance companies do to make it so much harder. We're continuing to have to fight them tooth and nail with all that, which seems counterproductive. Like it'd be so much, every time I get a new adjuster, I always make the joke, okay, are you good cop or bad cop? Because I've got, I got good cop last time. I'd like another good cop. Sometimes you can actually get them just kind of having that conversation off the get-go, because it turns out nobody wants to be identified as a bad cop. And so I've noticed I've been able to get a little bit more.
It's hard to be a good cop, though.
Yeah, right. Because the whole business model is very strange, right? The idea is that they want you to pay more and to be as profitable as a business as possible. When something like this happens, what they have to do is figure out how to legally pay you the least amount as possible, right? And so it's morally and legally, none of these things are in sync. So it's it's bound to be this way, and it's systematic, right? But to your point, the California Fair Plan isn't necessarily like that, but it's not sustainable either. So we're just all in this.
And it's a very limited coverage. I would like to, I know we don't have much time left, but I would like to mention one thing that I think would be helpful to people to understand, because one of the things that always happens when a new person calls me and I say, well, let me take a look at your policy. people don't know what their policy is. And they'll send me, a few random forms. What your policy consists of is something called a declaration page. And your declaration page, it may be one page, it may be more than one page, but it'll set forth your name, the property address, mailing address, the term of your policy, your limits, and then importantly, it'll set forth all of the forms and endorsements that are part of your policy. And that'll include what's usually a main policy form for homeowners, like we're mostly dealing with in here, a main policy form, and then a lot of endorsements that change that coverage, add that coverage, or most likely add more exclusions to that coverage. But that's your full policy. So a lot of people don't even have their full policies. And luckily, because most people are able to get those things online now and through apps, they're more accessible. But it used to be this whole long, drawn out procedure to get the actual copy of your policy. And then once you do it, you need to look at, if you really want to make sure you have your whole policy, you need to look at the declaration page, and where it has the forms listed, you need to then go through the forms, and the form number will be usually at the bottom or at the top, but you need to check it off and make sure that you've got all the forms that are on that deck sheet, and that, that you actually have your complete policy.
Yeah, just one of the many hoops that we have to go through to get what we want. Renee, this has been amazing. I've learned so much. I think anybody who hears this will learn, and any homeowner who hears this is going to learn a lot as well. And I thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure.
All right. Say goodbye to Stevie for us too.
Okay, will do. Thank you.